Good evening, everyone. I'm Ashish Jhunjhunwala. I'm co-founder and principal engineer at Tuebora. Today, hope you were having a good event until now. It's probably, I understand it's the last talk of the day. Might be tired. So it won't be a long session. So what I wanted to cover today is what IGA capabilities you want to see when you are talking about cloud infrastructure entitlement management, typically called as CIEM. How do IGA solutions should help in managing these CIEM environments, typically like your AWS, Azure, GCP, and what are the typical problems you have. So if you look at your CIEM systems, these are not a traditional lifecycle management system because the permissions and policies, a lot of these are very dynamic in nature. You start instances, you kill instances, your entitlements are being granted at a fairly rapid pace as well as being taken away also in a very, very rapid space. So there are a lot of permissions which get accumulated because if you look at number of services each of these providers are providing, you have hundreds of services provided itself just by AWS, and people will grant permissions and they will just forget about it, and there's just accumulation of permissions across the board, and there's no tracking of who can actually do what in those environments. A lot of these being on cloud enhances the problem as well. So what we'll be going through today is walk you through how the approach we are proposing to manage these lifecycle processes for CIEM environments, and we'll go it from there. So if you look at the cloud infrastructure, there are primarily 4 key ingredients there. First one is compute. Compute primarily talks about what kind of data you are processing, what's the speed of processing of data, what is the kind of failover you want, and each of these vendors, primarily your AWS, they have their own services like your EC2, AWS ECR, or your Azure Lambda, AWS ECR or Lambda and functions like that. Similarly, your Azure has Azure Cloud, Azure stuff like that, which allows you to do these compute activities. Similarly, on the GCP side as well, you have your container instances and things like that, which help you to do these activities. The second one is storage. Storage is primarily about you have things like file-based storage, you have block storage, you have object storage, and each of these vendors have different services around it. Like AWS gives you S3, it has a EBS, it has a EFS. If you look at Azure, they have block storage, and they have Azure files, they have Azure tables, and things like that. Similarly, on the GCP side, they have their own things like persistence disk. So if you look at same thing, the next one is the networking piece. Networking is primarily about how different systems talk to each other, whether they can interact with it, what is the speed in which they can talk to each other. And again, each of these vendors have their own setup. AWS having a VPC and VPN kind of thing. Again, on the Azure has its own Azure Virtual Cloud, Azure Virtual Network as well. Similarly, on the GCP side as well. And then the last one is the services. Services is primarily some of the core infrastructure pieces which these vendors are providing as service, like related to your database, related to your job memory management, related to your notification engine and things like that. So all of these primarily are the core pieces when we talk about any cloud infrastructure. And each of these, if you look at the amount of variations which is there, you need some way to easily manage these systems, and how to do about that is what I'm going to get into the next stage. So what are the typical environments, what are the typical challenges when you look at a multi-cloud environment? So a lot of organizations, if you see, they would have AWS, they will have Azure, they will have GCP, because they are trying to use the best of the breed services available provided by them. So they might use some part of AWS, some part of this. So what are the challenges which come when you look at a multi-cloud environment? The first one is dynamicity. What I mean by dynamicity is, as and when you need some services to be used, you will allocate the resources, you will consume the resources, and you will deallocate. So as and when you are allocating the resources, the new entitlements are being created in the system, they are being granted in the system, and when they are deallocated, at certain point, these entitlements are taken out. In some cases, they just lie there in the system, and that makes all this environment very fluid in nature. So if you look at a standard applications, the entitlements are very static in nature. You will have it and you can either grant it or not. Here the entitlements itself are very fluid in nature. They keep on changing just by the nature of how these environments are. The second one is complex permission set. What I mean by that is, each of these providers, if you look at it, AWS, GCP, and Azure, they have their own way of managing permissions on the services they are providing to the user. And all of them are fairly rich in terms of the fine-grained controls they provide, but they are very complex in nature, and it's not easy for one person to understand. You need a very sophisticated person to just manage the permissions across all the services. And think about the same thing being done for multiple providers. It just magnifies the problem largefold. And how do they do it? If you take the case of AWS, what they have is they have resource-based policies, they have identity-based policies, they have policies which are out of the box, AWS-specific policies, and then they have something called a policy simulator which can give you what kind of permissions are there. If you look at Azure, they work on a notion of they have roles and groups, and then they have policies with allow and deny. If you look at GCP, they have custom roles, predefined roles, and something which you can come as out-of-the-box roles. So everyone has their own way of managing it, and it's not easy for single person or anyone to look at it, at least your business managers or line of business, to know what permissions to be granted. So if you look at your manager or someone, they won't even know what to request for in that, if you look at a granular level for each of these data providers. So the third one is the inconsistent security model. So this is what roughly I covered. Each of these services itself, so if you look at just AWS, if you look at compute, if you look at network, if you look at storage, each of these services have their own security model, how they are managing these services. The permissions which are defined when you are looking at a, let's say, a Aurora service from AWS versus when you're looking at an OpenSearch, or when you're looking at managing just the VPC or the EC2 instances, they're all disjointed. They're not easy for anyone to understand, and forget about if someone is trying to do the governance, certification, and request. There is no way people will know what to request for and what to do with these services. So what's the thing which needs to happen? What needs to happen is we need to figure out some standardized way of dealing with these environments. So there's some kind of abstraction which has to be done, which sits on top of these cloud providers and gives you a common way of managing permissions, reviewing the access which has been granted to various users in these providers. So in order to do that, what we are going to suggest is it's a 5-step process which we have come up to manage or govern these multi-cloud providers. The step 1, which is critical, is developing a business context. What I mean by developing a business context is, this is what we need to do here is that you look at how your organization is functioning, right? Okay, so it could be a function of, it's based on, okay, for these departments, I'm using this particular cloud infrastructure, or these are the services I need to use. For this particular division of the organization, I need to use this particular services in the cloud. So what you need to do is you need to develop a business process, or what you call as a business process, to say that for my organization, these are the business process for which I am managing these services, and all your management of services are going to happen based on that. So in order to build this business process, there are three key components. The first one is organization unit. What I mean by that is you can have a big organization, but ultimately you will manage services at an org unit level. And this org unit is something you can create logically, either based on the function in the organization, or it could be based on how the budget is allocated. Sometimes you will have projects which are across organization, across various departments. So you can just create these org units logically based on how you want to separate out, okay, for these this particular business unit or org unit, these are the things these are the services I need to use across various cloud providers. That is one way to look at it. And then your identities can be part of these OUs, what we call it, and they can have your nested structure. So this is more like, if people know about Active Directory, more like that is how you at least manage your identities. The second one is, most of these organizations, they will have different kinds of processes. One set of processes are things which are regularly running, or at least very frequently they will run and stop, or at a frequent interval. These are like your onboarding process, users are coming and going, those kind of processes which are permanently running, but some of this could be continuous running, or some runs at a different interval. So are we building or are we managing these services for which of these processes? One way to look at it. The third one is, sometimes you will have short duration projects. You'll say, okay, hey, I need to do this activity and I need these services to be done for it. Once it is done, everything taken out, there is no process, or there is no data around those programs and projects. So you're looking at, when you're looking at a business context, you can divide it based on your business processes which are long running, or you can divide it based on your programs, or just at an OU level itself. The processes and the programs, which are the two things which are actually running, they can span multiple OUs depending on how they are set up. So that's what I mean is, so when you looking at your cloud provider, the first thing you need to do is make sure you understand in what context you are actually managing these services. The second step, which is very critical, is designing the entitlement catalog, because we are talking about multiple services, multiple cloud providers having disjointed way of managing permissions, whether it is based on resources or policies and things like that. So what do we do? How do you design an entitlement catalog? So if you look at cloud infrastructure, right, there are primarily two parts to cloud infrastructure. One is all the services which these guys provide. Different providers have different services. The second part is the permissions or the security which is set up on these services. They are typically, if you look at these providers, they have roles, groups, and permissions defined in some shape or form on top of these services. So that's how these cloud infrastructures are managing it, these services. Now, what needs to happen is the IGA solutions, what they need to do is, they need to come up with a model where they can abstract out the permissions, so that when someone is managing these cloud providers, there is an abstract way to define, okay, hey, I'm able to do this in this particular provider, and that this is not something which is specific to a provider, but it's an abstracted out model of modeling, checking out what it is. So in order to do that, what we'll do next is, if you look at it, what we are saying is, if you look at the business context, is the first thing which we just covered. The second part is the primary piece of abstraction which we are suggesting. That is what is called as roles. There are certain roles. What we are suggesting is, these are some of the roles which can be built to abstract out what it is. The first one is administrator role. This is the person who has the maximum knowledge about these environments in terms of what services are, what kind of permissions are there, and he is the main person who is responsible to make sure that the permissions are, appropriate permissions are there, excess permissions are not there. But the problem is, while this person will know technically all these providers, he will not have a business. He or she will not have a business context around it. That business context is available with the second role, which is owners. Owners are typically the owners for these OUs or your business processes or the projects and programs I talked about earlier. They are the ones who will come up with the business side of it, saying that, hey, these people should get permission or these people should not get permission, this particular role. And that's what is enforced by the administrator when they are doing this activity. The third one is the security auditor. They are primarily the person who are ensuring that the permissions are in place, the access permissions are not there. So their main responsibility is to make sure the risk is properly managed in these environments across the board, because under access is one issue, over access is also one issue, and all the entitlements which are accumulated become a problem. The last two roles are primarily for the people who are actually taking part of the processes. So let's say if you have a joiner process running, who is looking at what access are there. So that's where these two roles come into the picture, the contributor and the viewer. Contributor are the people who are actually taking part in the process. So they will need permissions as and when required for that particular process. So they might need permissions, access to some instances, or they won't need access to some particular services within the cloud provider. The viewer is purely a read-only role for someone who can just look at the access and look at the various data across these cloud environments. So that's where the second abstraction which comes, which is roles. You can very well define your custom roles as well. This is just things which we are suggesting in terms of how to manage the permissions overall. Ultimately, the idea is these roles will extend it at the time of enforcement. That's where you will expand these roles into actual permissions and apply it on these systems. The third step is, now we have built the roles, we have built the business context, we have built the entitlement catalog. The third one is to build the policies which needs to be enforced in these cloud providers exactly. So, and in order to enforce these cloud policies, there are two things. One is the policies which are out of the box available with these providers, and the other one is the policies which will be mined based on the existing permissions which are available in these environments as well. So the process, I'll go into details of the process of how do you design a policy catalog. The step one is, we'll just collect the policies from the providers itself directly. So all these providers are going to, you go to AWS, you go to GCP or whatever it is, you just go and collect these policies. The second part is where we mine the policies, or when I say policies in this sense, it's actually provisioning policies here. So we look at your existing distribution, what are the permissions granted in these providers, and mine the provisioning policies to come up with a representation saying that, okay, people in these profiles or these business process should have these access, should not have these access. So that's the recommendation which an IGA solution will do. And both of these combined together is ultimately what needs to be merged, and in an intelligent way where it will come up with the process where it say that, hey, people with these things will have these access, and what you can do is you can actually simulate that. So a lot of these providers have a way to simulate the policies as well. And ultimately, when you merge them, you do a review process and you come up with the recommendation saying that, okay, these policies look good, these policies should not be there, or anyone who is matching this criteria or these attribute profile should get these access, and anything which is not matching will be tagged as an anomaly in the system, and that can be taken out subsequently via a different process. So that process of circular, looking at getting the feedback from the system, from the cloud providers, reviewing it, running the algorithms on the existing data, coming up with this provisioning policy and merging, that's where ultimately it will result in a policy catalog where you have your ideal policies or policies which are which are built for that particular environment, and they will be cloud agnostic. So what you can do is, if you switch from this provider to that provider, your policies don't change. Underlying enforcement is what will change if you change your provider. So with these three things in place, so you have your business context, you have your roles, you have your policy set up. With this in place, your CIEM system actually becomes governance ready, because at this point of time, what you will do is, once I have defined this, the governance process which will be followed to manage these systems is going to be, what people will do is, when they are requesting access, they will say that, okay, I want an administrator role for this project, or I want a security auditor role for this project. That's the level at which they will do the request will happen in the system. The reviews also will happen at the same level. So who has the owner role, or who has security auditor role in this project or in this program or this initiative, is what at the level at which people will interact with the system when they are making sure that things are in place from the risk management perspective. They can also review the policies itself to say that, okay, these are the various policies. Some of it should be categorized as these should be there, or these are something which will be there for certain duration of time as well, and some are something which should never happen, never have. So that's where you do your third level of governance on the thing. And the fourth one is the deprovisioning activities, or the provisioning activities in the cloud infrastructure will actually happen via these policies. So once you have defined your policies, the enforcement or the changes in these systems will actually be driven by the policies which have been defined there. The fourth point is, okay, we have built a business context, we have defined the catalog, we have defined the policies, but ultimately we need a way to measure whether these policies are effective or not. Otherwise it doesn't, you might do something, but you will not have a way to justify that whether whatever we have come up with actually makes sense, or they are actually effective also or not. So that's where the fourth thing comes, where you have to measure the usage, what are their excess entitlements, are they being removed, monitor the trend of it, and then look at it. So the first matrix, which is very important when you're looking at these environments, is usage. The usage is, you have granted these entitlements to various people across various services. Now, if they are not being used, or they are something which are they just not being used and they are accumulating over a period of time, then there needs to be a process where these are regularly removed. So the usage has to be monitored regularly, and whatever is not being used is something which should be removed immediately. The second one is excess entitlements. These are like entitlements which have been lying around for a long time, which should not be granted based on the policies. They should automatically be removed. The third one is effective permission. So what it means is, while we are looking at all these policies, roles, and things like that, what we also need to understand is, lot of these systems have policy permissions which are granted indirectly, because you might be part of a group or something like that, or you have a policy which internally gives you permission at something which is not like that. So what you need to do is, you need to look at what my cumulative permission is for this particular identity in a cloud provider. So you should be looking at periodically looking at the effective permissions, and most of these providers give you a mechanism where you can look at the effective permission of a particular identity as well. So you go and look at the effective permission, and if we find any kind of toxic combinations, they should be removed. The fourth one is cost, which is quite important. While once we have come into this cloud providers, the cost is something which needs to be, it has simplified the way in which you start your processes, because the infrastructure is available immediately, but it becomes a problem, because when you are starting a project, what you need to make sure is, other than looking at your resourcing cost or the external tool cost, you need to look at the cost of your infrastructure, which is there on the cloud as well. And you need a mechanism to track these costs as well, whether you are getting over budgeted based on the project or not. One way to handle this is use your request service, with typically present in an IGA solution. So when you need a new infrastructure, use a request process to request for it, and along with that, set a budget on it. So when you're requesting, hey, I need these services, but this is the budget with which it is getting approved. And if you are exceeding that budget, you need to raise a new request. And if you're crossing it, for some reason, the system should go and automatically generate alerts and alarm in the system. So these are the 4 metrics which you need to continuously monitor when you're looking at a solution like that, to make sure that while the permissions are handled, the cost is also something which is a very important factor. Otherwise, you might end up crossing your project budgets very fast when you're looking at these providers. The final step in this governance strategy is you need to have a continuous model of refining the policies and the entitlements. Like I said, you have the projects which are continuously coming up, projects which are dormant or they have completed and all. And what needs to happen is all those entitlements tied to projects which have been completed, closed, or they are no longer active, they needs to be taken out, and policies associated with those projects should be taken out as well. And continuous review of these entitlements need to happen, because the new projects are coming in, new business processes are coming in, existing ones are changing. So there is a continuous refinement of these policies and entitlements which needs to happen as well. So with this, what we have is, these are the 5 steps how you can govern. Out of this, if you look at step 1 to step 4, they are primarily initially that's where most of the heavy lifting has to happen when you are setting up a process like that. The step 5 is which needs to be continuously monitored over a period of time, and it is something which will be there because new processes and new projects will keep on coming up. So what are the top recommendations when you are looking at some CIEM setup? One is you set up a business context, which is very critical. So you will not be able to manage your cloud providers, different cloud provider permissions if you look at it holistically across all projects. You always have to look within a context of a process which is using it, or within a context of a project. Based on your context, you will have to redefine your entitlement model. It could be roles, the policies which we come up. Those are some of the things which you have to continuously monitor and make changes to it. Whatever is the finding. The third one is when you do your policy simulations, or when you are mining the existing data from the cloud providers, you need to make sure that those policies and those simulation is something integrated into your IGA solution as well, where I should be able to look at an identity and say, give me an effective permission for this one in this cloud provider, and it should go and get you that data. Track the metrics regularly on the usage and costing. And then the last one is you need to develop a shared model, responsibility model, where we are talking about it's not one person's responsibility to make sure all the permissions are in process. You will have IT involved, you have line of business owner involved, you'll have people who are actually part of the project also involved. All of these together need to be the stakeholders in this process when they are looking at the managing the permissions on these cloud providers. So, yeah.